Congregational Church. My name is Clayton Hurd, and I'm honored to serve as the chair of the Board of Social Justice and Outreach. And we are so excited to be partnering with Long Beach Suffrage 100 for this amazing event. Long Beach Suffrage 100 is engaging in a year-long celebration acknowledging the struggles of so many women to guarantee the right to vote. And I would like to acknowledge one special person, Zoe Nicholson, the leader and founder of Long Beach Suffrage 100, and I hope you get a chance to talk with her after the show. She'll be available to answer your many questions that may arise from this performance. And there she is, sneaking in. Perfect timing. Refreshments provided by the Wilmore Baking Company in the Koinonia Room, which can be found by making a left as you exit the sanctuary. And so now I'd like to introduce the senior minister here for our Congregational Church, Elena Larson.
It's so lovely to see familiar faces and new faces here this evening, and it is my privilege to warmly welcome you on behalf of the congregation. You're going to be hearing a lot of historic dates tonight. And anytime you hear one, I invite you to consider in 1888, this was a bare patch of land where the Congregational Church was founded by a woman, Margaret Bixby. And then this space was built in 1912, another important date you'll be hearing about this evening. And throughout that whole time, we have always striven to be a congregation dedicated to justice and education and advancement of all people. So I am especially proud to be able to be part of tonight's festivities. And I do want to ask you to join me, if you would be so kind. At the end of the evening, there will be an opportunity to make a financial contribution. There'll be baskets available in the narthex, which is the room as you exit, and in the Koinonia Room where the reception will be occurring. I invite you to give generously so that we can continue to uplift the history, which is still so important to keep us fighting for truth and justice today. I welcome you, and I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy this evening.
Ain't I a woman? My name is Susan B. Anthony. As a warrior on the front lines of the abolitionist movement and then the suffragist movement for almost 70 years, I will endeavor to be your humble guide this evening. We come here tonight not to present an all-inclusive story of women's fight for suffrage, for that task would take many evenings and more hours than we have time for. Our goal is to share with you a history of those women and men who devoted their lives to the ideal that the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, ought to recognize the right of half its citizens to decide who represents them in their government. I invite you to join me as we journey down the long and arduous road to achieving women's suffrage.
The suffrage movement in America is not a linear story. It intersects and overlaps many other factions and movements, including the abolitionist movement,
the temperance movement,
the labor movement,
the free love movement. Oh yes, that was real.
The idea that suffrage was to be gained through a constitutional amendment was not preordained. Many felt it was a states' rights issue, especially the southern states. Also, past histories have too often told only the stories of white women and ignored the contributions of African Americans and Native Americans who were fighting for their very existence, let alone the right to vote. The suffrage movement is historically dated from 1848 up to that red letter day of August 26, 1920, when women secured their right to vote. But the movement didn't really begin or end there. Women long before and for generations since have been part of the ever-widening circle of champions for justice and freedom for all people. We know that an early proponent was our very own founding mother, Abigail Adams, who warned her husband and future president.
We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation.
As Sally Wagner states in her recent book, The Women's Suffrage Movement, a source we have drawn on extensively for tonight's program. As we celebrate women gaining political voice in the United States, the accurate story begins with the celebration of the women who had political voice on this land 1,000 years ago. These women lived in native nations that tenaciously held on, as well as they could, to their system of real equality, despite the best efforts of missionaries, boarding schools, and federal and state governments alike to deprive them of it.
Along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Jocelyn Gage was one of the three major founders of the National Woman Suffrage Association. Gage saw the Native American model firsthand. She lived in central New York, the center of the 5 original Iroquois nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Gage was given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation.
I give you the name Garon Ilhawi, meaning she who holds the sky. This will admit you to the Council of Matrons, where you will have a voice in the chieftainship.
How amazing this must have been to a woman who went to trial for voting in a school board election.
The traditional history of women's fight for suffrage in the United States begins in 1848 at the first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York, organized by a small group led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an active abolitionist and avowed atheist, and Lucretia Mott, a Quaker preacher, attended by about 300 mostly women, but also men, including abolitionist, social reformer, and orator, Frederick Douglass.
In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of woman and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world.
After 2 days of discussion and debate, 68 women and 32 men signed a Declaration of Sentiments. Drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, this 1848 document sets the agenda for the women's rights movement.
Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States.
In 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention takes place in Worcester, Massachusetts, attracting more than 1,000 participants. National conventions follow yearly for the next decade. Not only working for the vote, activism also focuses on gaining property rights, education, employment opportunities, equal pay for equal work, guardianship of their children, the right to divorce, and an end to oppression by religious dogma.
Free love, free thought, and dress reform conventions spin off as women challenge the institutions of marriage, religion, with great social norms of fashion, and the sexual double standard. Donations arrive to fund the work, including funding paid organizers. Susan B. Anthony quickly emerges, single, committed, and needing employment. She travels extensively in support of women's suffrage, working on many state campaigns and giving as many as 100 speeches per year.
Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less.
While women are organizing nationally for their rights, sadly, the federal government strengthens the institution of slavery by taking away any safe spaces on U.S. soil for slaves who are running to freedom. President Millard Fillmore signs the Fugitive Slave Act into law in September of 1850. Fugitive slave cases are now under federal jurisdiction, and the safe zones northern states had created when they abolished slavery are now illegal.
On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass gives a keynote address at an Independence Day celebration and asks,
"Fellow citizens, what to the slave is the 4th of July? This murderous traffic is today in active operation in this boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on the highways of the South. I see the bleeding footsteps. I hear the doleful wail of fettered humanity on the way to the slave markets, where the victims are to be sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There I see the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men. My soul sickens at the sight. but a still more inhuman, disgraceful, and scandalous state of things remains to be presented. By an act of the American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. By that act, Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States. Your broad Republican domain is hunting ground for men, not for thieves and robbers, enemies of society merely, but the men guilty of no crime. Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Americans, you boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. Had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake.
The suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement find common cause with many of the same activists, and in many ways are inseparable until the end of the Civil War. After its start in Seneca Falls, many local women's rights conventions follow. In 1851, a former slave named Sojourner Truth addresses a convention in Akron, Ohio.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? Now that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helped me into a carriage or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? I could work and eat as much as any man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all of them sold off into slavery, and when I cried out in my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing here in the head. What's it they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with the women's rights or Negro rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little measure full? Then that little man in black over there, he says, women can't have much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman? That ain't had nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever created could turn the world upside down all by herself, then all of these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they're asking to do it, and these men had better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now that's all old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say.
Every round goes higher and higher.
1865 put a halt to efforts for the suffrage movement as women focused their energies toward the war effort to fight the passage of the 13th Amendment to end slavery. As Secretary of the Women's National Loyal League, Susan B. Anthony's 1863 call went out for women across the country to petition to abolish slavery.
Shall we not all join then in one loud, earnest, effectual prayer to Congress, which will swell on its ear like the voice of many waters, that this bloody, desolating war shall be arrested and ended by the immediate and final removal by statute, law, and amended constitution of that crime and curse which alone has brought it upon us. Now, surely is our accepted time. On our own heads will be the blood of our thousands slain, if with the power in our own hands we do not end that system forever, which is so plainly autographed all over with the divine displeasure.
The tradition of women's rights conventions started up again in 1866, but with a difference. The door of freedom had been cracked open, and women and African American men could work together to finally create democracy the founding fathers had imperfectly created. A government for all. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped to establish a new organization, the American Equal Rights Association, the AERA, that works for universal suffrage, not just the right to vote for women, but for all citizens, regardless of race or gender. Robert Purvis, a vice president of the AERA, declares at the 1867 convention,
I cannot agree that this or any hour is especially the Negroes. I am an anti-slavery man because I hate tyranny and in my nature revolt against oppression, whatever its form or character. As an abolitionist, therefore, I am for the equal rights movement, and as one of the confessedly oppressed race, how could I be otherwise? With what grace could I ask the women of this country to labor for my enfranchisement, and at the same time be unwilling to put forth a hand to remove the tyranny, in some respects greater, to which they are subjected?
Not all abolitionists agree, and many proceed to work in gaining the vote for African American men only. The fall of 1869 finds the suffrage movement divided about whether to fight first for the right to vote to be granted to African American men only and not all citizens, leading to a major split that will last for over 20 years. On the one hand, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. The NWSA's primary goal is to achieve voting rights for women by means of a congressional amendment to the United States Constitution.
On the other hand, Lucy Stone and Henry Ward Beecher formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. The AWSA focuses exclusively on gaining voting rights for women through individual state constitutions.
With the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, ensuring the vote for African American men, the United States of America had officially become a government based on the consent of men only. As the question of who can vote is in the national spotlight, Francis Minor, the husband of NWSA officer Virginia Minor, comes up with a new legal strategy.
The Constitution leaves to the states to decide the qualification of voters, but it does not give them the right to deny citizens the right to vote. And since the 14th Amendment expressly declares, no state shall make or enforce